Immanuel Kant, the famous intellectual philosopher from Germany, by Ferdinand Gives, narrated by Alistair Cunningham. Introduction. Immanuel Kant was born on April the 22nd, 1724, in Königsberg, Prussia, or what is now Kaliningrad, Russia. While tutoring, he published science papers, including General Natural History and Theory of the Heavens in 1755. He spent the next 15 years as a metaphysics lecturer. In 1781, he published the first part of Critique of Pure Reason. He published more critiques in the years preceding his death on February the 12th, 1804, in the city of his birth. Immanuel Kant single-handedly set the stage for German philosophy in the 19th century. I will emphasize those of his doctrines which were most influential on such 19th century philosophers as Schopenhauer and Hegel. Philosophy. A philosophy, according to Kant, is the outcome of the use of human reason, which undertakes investigations a priori or independently of experience. Reason also has both a theoretical and a practical employment. Reason is theoretical when it is concerned with the way things really are, and it is practical when it considers how things ought to be. Thus, the two main branches of philosophy are metaphysics, the investigation into the a priori nature of reality, and ethics, which seeks a priori for rules governing the way in which beings with free will ought to decide what to do. An important difference between the traditional practice of metaphysics and ethics illustrates Kant's fundamental orientation towards philosophy. He believed that traditional metaphysics attempts to describe objects that are completely beyond the scope of the senses. It divides objects into a sensible world and an intelligible world, and claims that human reason has insight into the nature of purely intelligible objects. Ethics, on the contrary, treats the practical use of reason as if it were concerned only with sensible objects, most importantly with their relation to pleasure and pain. Kant maintained that metaphysics must be confined solely to the discovery of those rules which govern the sensible world, while ethics has nothing to do with anything sensible. Kant considered himself to be a revolutionary thinker. He believed that he brought to philosophy a new method, which he called criticism. Other philosophers had brought forth their systems without having examined beforehand the power of human reason to think about objects a priori. Criticism reveals the inherent limitations of reason in its theoretical employment, and as a result, it repudiates transcendent metaphysics. But it also reveals the power of reason over its own domain of objects of experience. It further reveals that reason dictates to itself the moral law. Full-fledged scholar and philosopher. In 1755, Immanuel Kant returned to the University of Königsberg to continue his education. That same year, he received his doctorate of philosophy. For the next 15 years, he worked as a lecturer and a tutor and wrote major works on philosophy. In 1770, he became a full professor at the University of Königsberg, teaching metaphysics and logic. In 1781, Immanuel Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason, an enormous work and one of the most important on Western thought. He attempted to explain how reason and experience interact with thought and understanding. This revolutionary proposal explained how an individual's mind organizes experience into understanding the way the world works. Kant focused on ethics, the philosophical study of moral actions. He proposed a moral law called the categorical imperative, stating that morality is derived from rationality, and all moral judgments are rationally supported. What is right, and what is wrong is wrong. There is no grey area. Human beings are obligated to follow this imperative unconditionally if they are to claim to be moral. Early life. Immanuel Kant was the fourth of 9 children born to Johann Georg Kant, a harness maker, and Anna Regina Kant. Later in his life, Immanuel changed the spelling of his name to Canto to adhere to German spelling practices. Both parents were devout followers of Pietism, an 18th century branch of the Lutheran Church. Seeing the potential in the young man, a local pastor arranged for the young Kant's education. While at school, Kant gained a deep appreciation for the Latin classics. In 1740, Kant enrolled at the University of Königsberg as a theology student, but was attracted to mathematics and physics. In 1746, his father died, and he was forced to leave the university to help his family. For a decade, he worked as a private tutor for the wealthy. During this time, he published several papers, dealing with scientific questions exploring the middle ground between rationalism and empiricism. Later life and death. In 1755, Kant returned to the University of Königsberg to continue his education. Within the same year, he received a doctorate from philosophy. He spent the next 15 years working as a lecturer and made a living from fees that were paid by the students attending his classes. But he also devoted a lot of his time to writing on various topics, although his greatest masterpiece, The Critique of Pure Reason, was published only in 1781. A decade earlier, he finally became a professor at the University of Königsberg and taught metaphysics and logic until 1797. During the last years of his life, he became embittered due to loss of memory, which severely affected his ability to work, but he continued to write nearly until the very end of his life. He died in 1804, aged 80. Personal life. Kant was only 5 feet tall, thin and of fragile health. Nevertheless, he reached, at the time, an extremely old age, which he attributed to his strict daily routine. He got up at 5 o'clock every day and spent the next hour drinking tea, smoking his pipe, and meditating. From 6 to 7 o'clock, he prepared for lectures he then gave at home until 9 o'clock. He then worked in his study room until 1 o'clock and spent the next 3 hours dining, usually with his friends. After his only meal, he took a 1-hour walk and spent the afternoon and evening for reading and writing. The renowned German philosopher was completely dedicated to his work and never married. Work and philosophy. Kant's philosophy is often described as the golden middle between rationalism and empiricism. He didn't accept either of both views, but he gave credit to both. While rationalists argue that knowledge is a product of reason, empiricists claim that all knowledge comes from experience. Kant rejected, yet adopted both, arguing that experience is purely subjective if not first processed by pure reason. Using reason while excluding experience would, according to Kant, produce theoretical illusion. The German philosopher published his first work, Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces, in 1747. Explaining the nature of space, Kant rejected post-Leibniz rationalists, arguing that metaphysical methods can prove the existence of essential force. Afterwards, Kant mainly focused on philosophical issues, although he continued to write on science, and similarly to Leibniz, also criticized Newton's views. Kant's first notable philosophical works were published in the 1760s. These were The False Subtlety of the Four Syllogistic Figures, 1762, Attempt to introduce the concept of negative magnitudes into philosophy, 1763. The Only Possible Argument in Support of a Demonstration of the Existence of God, 1763. Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, 1764. Inquiry concerning the distinctness of the principles of natural theology and morality, also known as the Prize Essay, 1764. After taking the office of a professor at the University of Königsberg, Kant wrote an inaugural dissertation on the form and principles of the sensible and intelligent work, 1770, after which he didn't publish anything for more than a decade. His next work, Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, was followed by nearly a decade of original and influential works which turned the philosophical thought in a whole to a new direction. Kant's most influential mature works include Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, 1785, Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, 1786, Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, Critique of Judgment, 1790. After the so-called critical periods, named after his three critiques, published between 1781 and 1790, Kant's health began to deteriorate rapidly, but he continued to write. The most important works of the post-critical period include Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, 1793, and Metaphysics of Morals, 1797. Chapter 1. Happiness according to Aristotle and Immanuel Kant. We are taught at a very young age that we are to seek out happiness, yet no one really knows what that is. When you are a child, happiness can be found by playing with toys and schoolmates. When we are children, our concept of happiness is minimal. As years pass, our concept of happiness becomes much more expansive. We are schooled to think that if we succeed at something, whether it is at a career, college, or in relationships, we are seeking to be happy. Some people seek out happiness through religion or a spiritual leader. Whoso trusteth in the Lord is happy. Proverbs 4:7. It seems that everyone has their own idea as to what makes them happy. It becomes ingrained in us that seeking happiness is the point of our existence. To find happiness, then we will be living a complete life. What makes happiness, or better yet, where happiness exists, is a question that has been pondered by many great thinkers. Aristotle and Immanuel Kant had quite a bit to say on the subject. Both of these well-known philosophers have a roadmap, if you will, to happiness. Yet their theories differ ultimately in how to go about attaining happiness. Aristotle wrote that we choose happiness always for itself, and never for the sake of something else. He believed happiness to be the end, and it is self-sufficient. It is the end at which all virtuous actions aim. It must be some good or set of goods that in itself makes it worth living. There are two features Aristotle believes must be present in the notion of happiness. One is that it must be an end rather than a means. For example, I find out that by being cheerful, I make money, so I go about making money by having a cheerful disposition. Ultimately, my aim is to make money, so according to Aristotle, my happiness is to be found in riches. Because I found out that being cheerful, which is not the same as being happy, I could make money, I adopt the attitude that by being cheerful I can attain riches. Aristotle disagrees with that because my ultimate goal is to get riches. It is not to be happy. The second is that happiness is self-sufficient in itself. It is to be sought only for itself and not for the sake of anything else. Aristotle specifically mentions the life of gratification, pleasure, comfort, and the rest, the life of money-making, the life of political action, and the philosophical life, i.e., the life of contemplation or study. He has no patience with the life of money-making or the life of gratification. Yet, Aristotle does agree that living a life of comfort is pleasurable. He also writes that it is only through the virtues that happiness can ever be experienced. Virtues are habits of the soul by which one acts well, i.e., for the sake of what is fine and noble. As Aristotle puts it, virtuous actions express correct, right reason. They are acquired through practice and habituation. One becomes virtuous by acting virtuously, i.e., by acting as a virtuous person acts, doing what one should, when one should, in the way one should do it. The virtuous person comes to take pleasure in acting virtuously. Hence, one sign that we have not acquired a certain virtue is that when we perform actions of the sort associated with that virtue, we do not take pleasure in these actions, but instead find them burdensome. Similarly, one becomes deficient by allowing certain defective ways of acting to become habitual. A person can acquire bad as well as good habits. Virtue is difficult to attain, since if we simply follow our inclinations, we fail to realize our potential. Even though we have a natural desire for happiness, our inborn inclinations often lead us away from our true happiness. Some never achieve virtuous activity and pursue only what immediately feels good. Self-gratification should not be the direct target of our actions. It is impossible to attain happiness without pursuing what is good and true. Intellectual and moral virtues are necessary and must be habitual. There are rules about what is virtuous and what is not. Everyone is capable of being virtuous, yet not everyone will be. Human beings are capable of learning, and through many years of careful study, a virtuous being can reach a complete and whole life. A person is not born virtuous, although at the time of birth a person is born with the senses. It is not until many years of learning that a human learns how to utilize these senses. It is important to note it takes time to learn and mature to be able to develop virtue. For example, a child, because of its young age, has not experienced the necessary needed lessons that life teaches to be virtuous. Aristotle wrote that a life of pleasure, a life of politics, and a life of study were essential to the complete and whole life. Living a complete life involves these goals. Living your goals in accordance with virtue is how to attain happiness. In other words, we have a responsibility to do what is worth doing, as well as doing what we are good at doing. This will lead to the supreme good, which is the end, which is happiness. For example, the pursuit of wealth was ruled out because money is only as good as what it can buy. It is how someone spends their money that shows us where they really think happiness lies. Is it on luxury, or to gain political power, or perhaps on spending it on the less fortunate? Those are what determine if a person is on the right road towards happiness. According to Immanuel Kant, the roadmap towards happiness is not as black and white. Kant thought that the means to happiness could not be clearly known. Kant believed that there was too much ambiguity in defining personal happiness, thus making it unsuitable as a basis for morality. Kant holds the pursuit of a person's own happiness or interest is of no moral worth whatsoever. Kant insists that we can never determine whether an action is good or right by considering its effects on one's happiness. He thought that a human is incapable of reasoning happiness to its principle. Happiness is indefinite, and although everyone wishes for happiness, he or she can never really know his or her true wishes and wills. Instead of searching for happiness, he found that the moral law constructed by reason is what a person should be seeking. Kant believes this to be the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is any statement of moral obligation which I make the principle of my action, my maxim in Kant's vocabulary. The categorical imperative refers to the principle that all our principles of action, maxims, could consistently become universal laws. Happiness is both too indefinite and too empirical to serve as the grounds of moral obligation. No two people share the exact same tastes, nor does everyone share the same interests and goals. Simply, what makes one person happy does not necessarily make another person happy. Everyone's experiences are different. Experience is necessary to attain happiness. In other words, I cannot know that something will make me happy by just thinking of it. Kant says that it is not possible to know a priori before an action whether it really will be conducive to our own happiness. The desire for our own happiness cannot serve as a motivator to determine our will to do this or that action. Our own desire to be happy cannot be completely known. Happiness is not good without qualification. According to Kant, the only thing that is good without qualification is a good will. Immanuel Kant's greatest discovery. The Sumerian culture at the dawn of civilization had a 7-day week. Each day had 24 hours, and each hour had 60 minutes. From their geometrical mathematical intuition, we inherited watches and clocks, and went on to develop technology able to carry information through millions of years of space-time. However, the Sumerians had no idea about the mathematics of infinity, which instead began as a religious concept about the nature of eternity. The Babylonian culture, which followed, developed a mathematics that was able to predict the 672 BC eclipse of the moon. By linking this ability to religious superstition, the mathematical priests controlled the people by fear, using scientific logic as an instrument of enslavement. During the 1800s, America's champion of liberty and freedom, Ralph Waldo Emerson, argued that American financiers had used the Babylonian trickery to enslave the people to a life of perpetual debt. He pointed out that the mechanistic technology adopted in America dismissed a supra-technology alluded to within the affinity belonging to Indian Sanskrit mathematics, which represented freedom from commercial serfdom. This mathematical trickery that controls the minds of people to accept financial enslavement is now quite well known. This mathematics, used for poker machine games, is designed to bring about a state of bankruptcy through a compulsion causing addicts to continually play. This deceitful mathematics, coupled with aesthetically pleasing sound and color combinations, manipulates dopamine functioning in the mind, creating mental anticipation to obtain some unsustainable future benefit. This addiction is known to be as strong as a heroin habit. Government revenues are collected that echo the gambling structure of the global stock market economy. This unethical phenomenon is simply a false imitation of a natural optical process called inner stereoscopic vision, which presents data allowing for logical outcomes to materialize. Stereoscopic signaling and communication scientists are beginning to realize that they have no control over the accelerating development of the unhealthy mind, or control over the flow of unethical information. The scientists began with investigating complaints that 3D films made a small percentage of viewers feel slightly nauseous, which was rectified by high-tech stereoscopic developments. Now, serious stereoscopic neurological signals and information are known to adversely affect the everyday life of the general populace, resulting in community isolation and depression that science cannot redress. However, a new neurological science that sought to rectify this problem was established by the linguist and physicist Guy Deutscher when he revived the discarded 19th century linguistic evolutionary colour perception theories of the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, and the philosopher of science, Wolfgang von Goethe. Deutscher's 2012 book of the year, Through the Language Glass, translated into 8 languages, contained the linguistic methodology needed to envisage the nature of future human survival technology. In that same year, the recipients of the Giorgio Napolitano Medal were awarded, on behalf of the Republic of Italy, for their quantum biological discoveries, compatible with Deutscher's findings. Their theories were acclaimed as an integral part of the 21st century Renaissance. For public relations, the new neurological human survival science and technology will be referred to as immortalizing Albert Einstein's scientific worldview beyond the limitations of the second law of thermodynamics. The 18th century philosopher of science, Immanuel Kant, recognized as influencing the 21st century science, is now the hero whose research explains the difference between aesthetics as art application theory and ethics as an artistic science for human survival. His discovery led directly to perceiving the Babylonian mathematical trickery that has now evolved into a deadly computer virus, trapping humanity into following a path towards global chaos. Kant was well aware that the invention of atomic mathematical 3rd century BC Greek science, taught at the Academy of Plato, was called the science for ethical ends. He also knew that its sister science concerning particle movement, taught at the Ho Kepos University, was called the science of universal love. Gravitational first course principles, taught at the universities, associated the monthly movement of the moon resonating to the atom of the mother's soul, explaining her intuitive love and compassion for children. Kant's research became the basis of the electromagnetic golden age of Danish science. Sir Isaac Newton published that the ancient Greek science was an authority on gravitational first cause principles, and that the idea of the mechanical mass of objects in space being the cause of gravitational force was, and I quote, a pretentious and illogical hypothesis. Whether Newton was right or wrong is not the point. Quantum mechanics was derived upon the false assumption that he had a completely mechanical worldview, when the opposite is true. Quantum mechanics and its offspring sciences cannot provide solid evidence of how to harness the first principle of logic concerning the healthy evolution of mankind. In particular, concerning the evolutionary purpose of inner stereoscopic vision. Immanuel Kant and his colleague Emmanuel Levinas predicted exactly how this can be done, exposing the very nature of the mathematical virus now controlling global scientific endeavor. By applying their published electromagnetic field properties to Newton's non-mechanical gravitational principles, the problem is solved. We now know how to balance research with mainstream science in order to develop such things as replacing fossil fuel with the previously mentioned omniscience and technology that Ralph Waldo Emerson predicted in the name of liberty. Art can be seen to inflict unethical messages upon society. For example, the Roman Colosseum was considered to be an art form that superseded all of Greek art. Its insatiable lust for slaughter made it an unethical monument to artistic aspirations. Beautiful religious edifices using grandiose pomp and circumstance as an artistic pageantry to evoke a lust for warfare against foreign gods can be seen as being unethical. Plato's warning that unethical mathematical sciences using artistic rhetoric and art forms could enslave the populace into a mindless consumer society. He predicted the present reality of non-stop televised commercial advertising. The mathematician, Plato, considered that art was an irresponsible and unethical practice, lacking a crucial spiritual ethic. Kant and Levinas agreed with that observation. They devoted in-depth research into the matter and classified the electromagnetic field reality containing the crucial spiritual ethic. They published that an asymmetrical electromagnetic inner vision within the artistic creative mind was the spiritual ethic that Plato sought to define. That message from the golden age of Danish science is the most important human survival discovery ever made. Harvard University, Massachusetts University, and the Royal Danish Consulate in 2004 held an international symposium to tell the world of the importance of the work of the electromagnetic golden age. They noted that it had been written mostly in Danish and not translated, making it invisible to English-speaking scholarship. Simply by viewing paintings over the centuries through Kantian asymmetrical electromagnetic glasses, the evolution of inner stereoscopic vision is revealed. The evolutionary development of the new human survival neurological science that Guy Deutscher's Book of the Year established from 19th century linguistic color perception theory can now be observed. 2 years ago, what was considered to be junk DNA was found to be another DNA strand communicating with the genetic system in the inner stereoscopic language of evolving health and well-being. The solution to quantum mechanics' greatest problem, called the uncertainty principle, was published by the journal Nature in a paper entitled "Sorry Einstein, the Universe Needs Quantum Uncertainty." That paper demonstrated that humanity is now poised at the threshold of utopia, despite being completely addicted to the process of second-law extinction. The present acceleration of chaos can be seen to exhibit the properties of cancer growth and development. Countries using trade embargoes to damage other nations are but one example of this contagious carcinogenic behavior upon the human species as one leading toward a terminal condition. Interference with the normal inner stereoscopic vision's evolutionary process can produce both heroin-strength addictions and short-circuit the functioning of the vagus compassionate nerve system. Recruiters for jihad terrorism can simply push the right buttons to evoke what is known as selfish gene activity to escape extinction at all costs without a single thought about normal mercy and compassion. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the golden age of Islamic science welcomed Jewish and Christian scholars to translate the ethical message of ancient Greek scripture at the Translator School in Toledo, Spain. As religious hostilities eroded that research objective, Sultan Mehmed II transferred the Renaissance to the Medici scholars in Italy. 200 years later, Christian hostilities associated with Christian Inquisition's merciless dogma had nullified all relevant human survival research discoveries in a mindless bloodbath of torture and burning people alive. It is now time for Western culture to re-establish the Islamic-inspired translator school mentality for the production of all scholars seeking the application of the new human survival and technology outlined in this paper. Chapter 2. Immanuel Kant and Scott Peck. Scott Peck was to psychology what Immanuel Kant was to Western philosophy. In the same way as Kant had used philosophy, after a blossoming during Enlightenment and Romanticism, to effectuate a return to the Protestant dogmas that philosophy had sought to replace, so did Peck use psychology, after its psychoanalytic beginnings in the early 20th century, and its existential, humanistic blossoming in the 1960s and 70s, to effectuate a return to religious dogmas that psychology had struggled to overcome. The philosophy of Kant, and the psychology of Peck, employed a device referred to by Mortimer Adler as suicidal epistemologizing and suicidal psychologizing. Kant claimed that the imperfection of human perception meant that it was only capable of apprehending the phenomenal, apparent, instead of the nominal, the true. He also claimed that beauty was relative, illusory, and insignificant, in the eye. With these claims, he trivialized and denigrated both science and art, in creating in the public mind the suspicion of both empirical and intuitive models of cognition practiced respectively by the Enlightenment and Romanticism. He destroyed both the Enlightenment and Romanticism. In the same manner did Peck, through his contributions, place in the public mind a contempt for and denigration of both reason and passion, equating the first with Cartesian logic that was inadequate to describe his experience of synchronicities, and claiming the second as an invalid basis for either relationship or meaningful interaction. The result has been contempt and invalidation of both reason and passion, and the destruction, first by philosophy and then by psychology, of both aspects of humankind. Both, of course, are wrong in all aspects. reason is not limited to Cartesian dogmatism, and the intellectual and scientific pursuits in higher physics, anthropology, and more advanced psychological studies have uncovered knowledge that entirely exceeds Cartesian dogmatisms and its brainchildren, namely skepticism, behaviorism, logical positivism, and similar abominations. True rationality, when taken to its logical consummation, results in respect for nature and for human mechanism as possessing great intricacy and great intelligence encoded in them, and the disrespect for the same is not a result of reason, but a result of inadequate reasoning. Beauty has been shown scientifically to exist both in absolute and in relative forms, with the Judith Langlois experiment showing that a face with certain proportions will be rated as beautiful by people across cultures, and another experiment in which 500 faces were shown to 20,000 participants saw every face being picked as the most beautiful by at least one participant. The implications of this affirms what both sides in the beauty debate are right about. The romantic idea that there is universal truth in beauty, as revealed by there being a mathematical formula for absolute beauty, and the egalitarian idea that there is someone for everyone, regardless of whether the people around them think they look good. The Langlois experiment therefore disproves the idea, taken by many in the politically correct movement, that beauty is only subjective, or that it is only cultural, or that it is trivial, or that it has no roots in reality. And the other experiment disproves the abusive idea that the people who are not deemed beautiful in their hometown will never find a suitable mate. As for romantic passion, the cultural cross-examination shows it to be a positive to every culture in which it exists. The Hindu and Muslim cultures that have forbidden romantic love feature far greater rates of violence against women than do the cultures in which romantic love is affirmed. In the West, the times that were favourable to romantic passion, Renaissance, the Romantic era, and the 1960s and 70s, likewise featured less violence against women and more appreciative treatment of women than the medieval era did. Also, the Reformation, Victorianism, and the 1980s that despised, devalued, demonized, or criminalized romantic love. And, in my own experience, it has been at the root of the best marriages I have ever seen. Marriages that produced wholesome families, meaningful and lasting love between partners, beautiful and intelligent and accomplished children, and are still going strong 50 or 60 years down the road. In taking the stances that they did, Kant and Peck thus became destructive of both the intellectual and the passionate aspects of the human being, and destructive of all the greatness and progress and the richness of life that these two aspects have produced. And in the pursuit of their dogmas was created a character that is essentially necrophilic and seeks to destroy, in its relations, policies, thoughts and activities, all that creates and affirms and adds to life. In both cases, a pursuit that produced great improvement for many and at multiple levels was effectively destroyed by being used against its own foundations. With Kant, philosophy had destroyed itself. The Enlightenment philosophy that made possible Western science and Western democracy, and the Romantic philosophy that made possible the world's greatest literature, cultural blossoming, and the richest interpersonal experience and relations, by claiming the mechanism for both to be imperfect or trivial. With Peck, so did psychology, in both its analytical and its humanistic aspect, by trivializing and denigrating the aspects of the human being to which it spoke, which it worked to describe, and the pursuits that have given the Western world its greatest accomplishments: democracy, science, innovation, freedom, great literature and art, understanding of nature, civil and human rights, meaningful and beautiful relationships between men and women, and humanistic, life-affirming values that went to a great length to make the most of both accomplishment and experience, were subverted by the pursuit that had conceptualized them, being used to destroy its own foundations. And in both cases, the result was an imposition against a flourishing of life through affirmation of passion and intellect, of orders and character that were fundamentally anti-life. The Victorianism that followed Kant, like the 3 decades that followed Peck, were contemptuous of both intellect and passion. Contemptuous as such of the life-enhancing and life-affirming aspects of humanity. It is a mentality that by its own nature can only lead to systematic violence, oppression, and war against both feeling and intellect, which lead directly to abusive, controlling, and systematically destructive mental, emotional, and relational habits in people who are part of that mentality. But, furthermore, still it leads to the destruction of all that thought and feeling make possible: science, democracy, freedom, ingenuity, innovation, human rights, beauty, compassion, art, love, vitality, and every meaningful form of improvement in people's lives. This, of course, has been the essential character of both the Victorian era and its more contemporary equivalent. And just as Kant and Peck came to believe that the source of evil was hubris, which their followers used to damn both reason and passion, and people who affirmed, cultivated, and benefited from both, so has the far greater hubris of their own mentality made apparent itself in its values and effects. In both cases, just as Kant used philosophy and Peck used psychology to destroy the ages of reason and passion, so have the concepts they brought in to replace them convicted the orders that they had ushered in. The Protestant morals that were used and then hideously misused to sustain the dark night of Victorianism were in the end employed themselves to convict as morally damnable an order that consigned the bulk of the people in it to colonization, child labor, brutality, squalor, suffocating formalism, hysterical prudery, international warfare, disconnection from life both within and without, and brutal, cruel, degrading, unforgiving existence. Likewise, the concept of responsibility that was used and then hideously misused for the last 3 decades is now making apparent the irresponsibility of suffocating innovation in the energy sector to keep alive the stranglehold of oil cartels, giving taxpayer subsidies to the beef industry that takes 10 times as much biomass to produce a burger than the vegetable industry to produce an equivalent amount of grain. Consuming 4,000 calories a day and driving SUVs while millions are dying because of disastrous climactic events caused by ecosystemic destruction and accumulation of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, destroying with no thought for the future or for what made them possible the natural treasures that man cannot conceivably recreate. And ladening the future generations with trillions of dollars in debt amid collapsing family incomes in order to pay for the irresponsible tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. By applying at the collective level the characteristic that is demanded of the individual is seen the corruption of the arrangement itself. Victorian moralism was rightfully used to show the moral wrongness of the Victorian order, and the more modern-day responsibility is likewise making apparent the irresponsibility of the present one. And, just as personality psychology has been used and hideously misused in the period following Peck to target people who thought or felt differently from the social or communal entities of place and time, whatever the character of these entities, or their intent, or the actual substance of their beliefs and behaviors, so it has been used by others, rightly or wrongly, to describe business, politics, religion, psychology, media, and even the Western civilization as possessing a psychopathic and predatory character. The same concept is now used by me to describe any communal or social entity that seeks unlimited power over the minds, beliefs, personalities, and lives of the people within it, and then seeks to impose itself upon others. To believe that an unofficial organ of power, that unlike official organs of power in a constitutional democracy, is not subject to check and balance and official accountability, is somehow less prone to corruption and wrong abuses of power than official organs of power, is ridiculous. Such an entity becomes a law unto itself, and therefore is capable of the worst forms of corruption and systematic crime. And in countries where the power of official organs is checked and balanced and made to accord with the Constitution and Bill of Rights, but for some or another reason the power of unofficial organs is not subjected to similar scrutiny and is thus used to commit the most horrendous abuses and most illegal abominations against the people within them and without them. These entities not only can be seen as unconstitutional, but in fact should be seen themselves as possessing the worst of these disorders. The sociopathic character that does not recognize the law is the character of the community or the social network that becomes the law unto itself, and thus not only perpetuates and then covers up systematic crime while totally controlling the people within it, but also commands of people inside of them unconditional loyalty, regardless of the scale of their crimes, against people both inside and without. And it is these entities, not the people that they demonize, that are the true danger, not only to democracy, but to humankind as it exists at this time, and as it stands to exist in the foreseeable future. The crimes and cover-ups of small towns, gangs, old boy networks, cults, Islamists, Jehovah's Witnesses, paramilitary organizations, and corrupt networks and operations in medicine, law, police, courts, psychiatry, and politics are a far graver threat to the rule of law than are the works of any number of axe murderers, and they affect people's lives to a far greater extent. The same can likewise be said of religions that think they are superior to both nature and to humanity, indeed to the entire universe, and denigrate, then destroy all accomplishments of science, democracy, business, art, literature, human rights, and nature in all its richness, in order to make room for their supremacy over a world that they have inherited both from nature and from the people who had created and contributed to these pursuits. The people who claim the universe to be God's, and all accomplishments of mankind and the vibrancy of nature and all things lovable to be belonging to God, appropriate for the church or the mosque that had created none of these things, that destroyed them where they existed, and resisted most of them every step of the way when they arose in the areas of their dominion. The credit for nature and for humanity and all things lovable and life-affirming, both natural and man-made. All things, of course, that the church and the mosque condemn, deny, sabotage, and then, when created by others and coerced from others, want to claim as their own to wield as tools of control against the existing and the yet to exist. Such an entity can by itself be seen as not only psychopathic and narcissistic, but totalitarian and indeed necrophilic. For such an entity to claim to define people, humanity, nature, and all that exists in the world as any kind of evil or good is preposterous. The evil belongs with these entities themselves and with the philosophers and psychologists, Immanuel Kant and Scott Peck, who brought them back into influence in these respective endeavours. After the mind and the genius of humanity in both these endeavours and their brainchildren had struggled to help humanity out of their grasp, the religious supremacism has become so complete as to war in the past decade, with effective and thoroughly disastrous results against both science and democracy, as well as constitutional law. In the same way as it has warred in the previous 2 decades against individuality, relationships, culture, eros, beauty and romance, it is now warring disastrously against science and democracy. First, it destroys romanticism. Then, it aims straight for the Enlightenment. And it is then that it is seen in its true character, in all its psychopathic, totalitarian, apocalyptic horror. The extent of the necrophilic character of such a mind is seen in its future predictions. Its hubristic hatred of life at all levels is so complete as to foresee a violent destruction of the world itself. And the economics and politics practiced by those who most loudly claim to profess Islam and Christianity are all directed towards planetary destruction and global war. There is no future in this. The future in this is complete destruction of all that lives on the planet, And I see it as the duty of man, as a being of life, to not only preserve nature, but to preserve humanity, and to create a future in which both humanity and nature can live, coexist, blossom, and reach their ever greatest fruition and accomplishment. This comes through thinking, and pursuing that activity at all levels. That is, affirming of life at all levels and dedicated to its enhancement, enrichment, and perpetuation. The necrophilic mentalities, and pursuant to the necrophilic effect on the world of all activities that they inform, must be replaced with ones that are biophilic and make the most of life, both human and natural. In short, medium and long-term. With this change in mind, all human pursuits, business, politics, technology, relationships, families, science, art, education, spirituality, can begin to work towards a viable future. The people who truly love and embrace life will value life, and will create demand for, and supply of, economics, technologies, policies, ideas, art, and modes of interaction that are life-affirming and that add to life, extend life, and make possible life worth living for their descendants and for humanity, as much as they will take care to protect life that they have not created. The people who think that destroying the world will get them to heaven will and do take their political, economic, spiritual, and interpersonal activities to the direction of violence, destruction, plunder, theft, torture, abuse, and ultimately death. To tip the balance for life, man must become a creator more than he is a destroyer. At all levels of thinking and all levels of action, man must do more to enhance life than he does to destroy it. It is then that there is a better future in view than that of the apocalypse, and it is then that man can be said to be equal to nature, and even possibly an improver. The period after Victorianism saw electricity, telephones, aeroplanes, automobiles, skyscrapers, women's rights, the middle class, the Panama Canal, national parks, higher physics, film, psychology, the Harlem Renaissance, Fitzgerald, Akhmatova, Modigliani, and an open, livable social climate that directly enhanced both the quality of people's lives and the accomplishment of civilization. What this period of innovation and freedom was for the 20th century can be accomplished on an even greater scale for the 21st. Solar and hydrogen energy, space travel and colonialization, nanotechnology, biotechnology, economics designed to maximize intelligent creation and minimize destruction of what one has not created, prudent resource management, intelligent positive collaborations between private and public sectors, affirmation and rigorous defense of human rights, values favorable to innovative and creative thinking, positive regard for and affirmation of both the feminine and the masculine, and a mutual understanding between one another, allowing beautiful and happy relationships and marriages, respect for and cultivation of both feeling and intellect, affirmation and cultivation of both individuality and dedication to the benefit of the species, and political and economic policies designed to maximize intelligent creation and minimize blind destruction, can be a seed of a renaissance with unlimited potential both for the currently living and for the yet to exist. This can only come from this: an understanding of and respect for life at all levels, allowing man to see and feel life at all levels, and, enriched with this understanding, to become an organ of life creation, life perpetuation, and life enhancement, making possible livable long-term futures for both the planet and humankind. Necessary is a concept of human being as an integral entity with relation to self, species, and nature that leads to an affirmation of individuality and an affirmation of humanity and an affirmation of nature, allowing people maximal self-definition, maximal contribution to the good of the species, and appreciation of nature, resulting in minimal damage to it. Necessary is a recognition and valuation of all aspects of life, in both natural and human forms, creating a life-affirming mentality that finds expressions in people's thoughts, feelings, and actions, and thus the effect on the world as well as the covenants they create. The values, perceptions, cognitions, and consequently arts, science, economics, policies, and relationships all stand to be improved by transition to modes of thinking that are affirming of life at the natural, individual, and species-directed levels. And then, all these pursuits will direct themselves to the creation of life and enrichment of life, instead of its destruction, while having respect enough for what man has not created to minimize damage to it. Philosophy's great minds and their contribution to the Bible story. Any study of ethics and ethos must include a visit into the world of philosophy. Briefly, we consider several philosophy contributors: Aristotle, Kant, Descartes, Augustine, Sartre, Spinoza, and Jesus the Messiah. We limit our philosophical giants to this august group in consideration for time and space. The biblical Jesus, of course, receives inclusion, without whom this book would lack purpose. Aristotle, the peripatetic, advocated the syllogism as means to establish truth, a process which prefers an input from major and minor premise, and thus to an acceptable conclusion. Aristotle's syllogism was akin to theocratic ordinances, requiring two witnesses for God for ordinance infractions or to adjudicate theocratic rules resident in God ordinances. Such influence to God existence and theocratic rule over the 12 tribes cannot be denied. Thus, we establish a means to reliable conclusion. Roughly quoted, Immanuel Kant observed, "No man has the intellect to deny another man's God." Astutely, he posited limitations to inquiry's broader scope as it then might pertain to the intangible. Then, Descartes coined the renowned adage, "I think, therefore I am." The two observations not only reinforce each other, but establish immutability in God's existence and its basic legal historicism. Atheists take note. Even so, such does not prove the omnipotence claimed. Theists take note. However, such philosophical profoundness leads to yet another great insight. Jean-Paul Sartre extended Descartes' astute observations to dimensions of existentialism. Sartre observed contemporaries exercising freedom of choice and therefore earning the burden for any fateful consequences, witnessed where ordinary men assume roles best suited to their own occasion or purpose. Thus, we address existentialism's definition. Simply, existentialism defines man's tendency to innovate existence, to adopt self-determination. This self-reliance was the one fault preventing righteousness for the patriarchs in Hebrews 11, though they had abundant faith. Existentialism attains better definition in a more familiar example, where Christians play a sympathetic role during fellowship, but regress to a lesser role outside church auspices. We might recall that self-determination was the downfall of Eve and Abraham's descendants, who sought Paul's better thing advocated in Hebrews 11:40. Which better thing awaited the grace opportunity posited at Romans 11:6. We find then, these great philosophers did much to limit and define the language used for principles and principles in biblical subtlety. At his own intellectual expense, St. Augustine noted an existential failing when he answered a friend's inquiry. "What is grace?" He answered, "I know what grace is until you ask me. But when you ask me, I do not know." Such admission might prompt further inquiry. What uncertainty in grace's definition elicited pause from the renowned St. Augustine? Such candor prompts inquiry into the non sequitur conclusions rampant in modernist exposition and sermon. To be sure, Bible language is difficult, and the cause for Augustine's incertitude magnifies the Romans 11:6 formula for attaining election status. We paraphrase the Bible text here: if by grace, then is attainment no more of works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. But if attaining election be of works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise, work is no more work. We commiserate with St. Augustine's uncertainty. And you think Paul is easy to understand? Paul is saying, works and grace are incompatible. Works cannot be the stars in your crown, nor is grace the unmerited favour so popularly envisioned. Problematic modern definitions compromise the grace extent in Romans 11:6. Here, grace is a time expression, and not tradition's mistaken material benefit. Such misunderstanding evoked the Messiah's displeasure at Mark in 8:21 for his disciples when they failed to understand the time, progeny, and ages semantic in loaves, fishes, numbers fed, and baskets of fragments. Do exegetes know? Actually, time is the single most urgent Bible topic. How would you respond if present at the Mark 8:21 query? Would readers respond differently today? We have a duty to extract Bible semantics, to transcend mediocrity, and to further interpretive excellence. However, excellence is rare. Spinoza convincingly summed it all up when he said, "Excellence is as rare as it is difficult." But we can and must seek excellence in whatever our endeavour. You can fall short of pure excellence, but any degree of excellence is superior to its opposite. Schopenhauer gave would-be philosophers their due when he accredits Spinoza. To be a philosopher is to be a Spinoist. If you strive for excellence, we invite your attention to further readings delving into the philosophy of religion. Truth is stranger than fiction, stranger than the misinterpretation still holding forth in traditional teachings. Immanuel Kant, landmark intellect of Germany. Immanuel Kant is widely considered as one of the most influential Western philosophers, publishing works on ethics, epidemiology, and metaphysics. Although hurting financially in his early life due to the death of his parents, he became known for his lectures, utilizing ideas from contemporary thinkers such as Hume, Hutcheson, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In the later years of his career, he published 3 books that were to be his most important: Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, and Critique of Judgment. As he progressed in his career, he was able to successfully criticize previous movements of thought, such as empiricism and rationalism. One of his more well-known arguments, which has also been seen used in art, is that aesthetic judgments should not be based on any property of the object, but rather on an objective ideal. Kant also argued for the necessity of a moral law that is recognizable by all, involving a categorical imperative that must be realized in every human being. In his opinion, the motive behind an action is what determines the moral worth of the action, not the outcome achieved. He died in 1804, still in Königsberg, without ever having journeyed far from his hometown in his lifetime. Through the years, he has been regarded as a major influence of many later philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, and Schopenhauer. Chapter 3. Exploring Kant through Descartes and Hume. One of the greatest philosophers to develop and refine epistemology, along with other philosophical concepts, is Immanuel Kant. With careful examination, thought, and concern, he developed a unique philosophy, that of transcendental philosophy, to extend both the worlds of rationalism and empiricism. By looking carefully at the former philosophers of notable importance, namely Descartes and Hume, Kant was able to see a very modern philosophy that lays basis to much thought and looks upon thought today. Examination of the two mentioned philosophers will only show their importance and contributions to Kant's foundation, and therefore the foundation that bonded empiricism and rationalism. Let us look at Descartes first. Descartes is a rationalist. He believes that there is some knowledge attained other than through or by the senses. For example, the saying "I think, therefore I am" is an important aspect of this concept. This is knowledge developed on thought alone. More importantly, it is heavily weighted on the knowledge of God. This is to say that the idea of God, and God itself, is outside of the realm of the senses, and so therefore exists through thought alone. Descartes shows us through his meditations that by using our mind and thoughts we can make judgments of the world around us. He believes that there are only two substances in the metaphysical. The first is thought, and the second, matter. He believes, contrary to ancient philosophy, that there is matter without form. He also holds that certain ideas, specifically that of the mind and God, are innate and independent of the senses. This is contrary to many other philosophers and their beliefs. The problem with Descartes is that a lot of his work is heavily based on the existence of God. This is to say that it requires God to help prove the concept of certain innate ideas outside of the sensible world. It is a very easy example to use and requires little to no backup support. This is because, since one cannot truly deny or prove the existence of God, one can merely say that he exists because they believe he does, and can twist this to put it as an innate thought. If one has faith in a God, then you cannot deny this faith. Descartes used this idea of faith to support his idea of innate ideas. It is easy to say that God exists and use that as evidence to a philosophical concept of innate ideas, because this requires no other basis. The very concept of God can be compared to Galliano's perfect island theory. This theory clearly states that there is no need to find empirical evidence of God's existence, and therefore completely supports the innate idea concept. The perfect island theory says that if one thinks of the most perfect island in their mind, then it must exist, for no other greater island can exist. The very definition of God is that which is the most perfect, and since nothing can be more perfect than God, it is only proper to confirm God's existence. Though debatably flawed, the theory does show the simple strength that faith holds to Descartes' philosophy. On the other hand, there is David Hume. Hume is an empiricist. Key to point out, as its opposite is a strong support basis for Descartes, is that Hume is a non-believer in God. Right there, we can understand that we are dealing on a more sensory account of the world and philosophy. We can rule out thoughts existing simply because there is no greater thought to conceive them, or that we have merely thought of them. He also believes in the copy principle. This is to say that ideas are acquired ideas. Hume states that there are two principal ways to organize beliefs. One is relations of ideas, which requires logical relations between the beliefs, while the other is matters of fact, which is the relation of a belief with the world itself. Furthermore, he denies that these matters of fact can only be known a priori, only promoting his empiricist views. Hume had a philosophy that was seen by many as being strongly based in skepticism. We can understand this by his belief in all knowledge coming by the senses. It is because of this we can only trust these perceptions, and therefore the knowledge that derives from them. By understanding the basics of the two philosophers mentioned before, we can get a better sense of the philosophy of Kant. Kant takes what he considers the better of the two worlds of empiricism and rationalism and develops a philosophy intended to satisfy the imbalance between the two. Let us start by looking at the very basics of the two worlds and compare a priori, knowledge based on experience, and a posteriori, knowledge after experience. He holds that both do exist. On one hand, that of a priori, we have such ideas of logic, of math, and other basic concepts that are not developed by the human mind, but rather recognized and taken from the natural world. Contrary is that of a posteriori, which Kant describes as being such things as science and sensory and analytical sciences, though done through the natural world, or developed or recorded in a human process. Even further, we can break the two in half and use a concept developed by Hume. We can look at these things as being analytic, the equivalent of Hume's relations of ideas, or synthetic, the equivalent of Hume's matters of fact. Dividing a priori, we can see Kant labels logic as analytic, while maths and other basic concepts are synthetic. If we are to, however, examine closer a posteriori through this, we find that science can only be synthetic and that there is no analytic a priori knowledge. So, from Descartes, we see that Kant has taken the logical sense of thought, the I think therefore I am type of reasoning, to support truth from reason alone. And from Hume, we see that Kant has taken the relationship of ideas between ideas and the relationship of ideas compared to the world. Kant also takes a good look at such mindful concepts as God, freedom, and immortality. This lays on the side of rationalism with Descartes. Looking at this, we can see that there is a break between appearance and reality of the world through possible experience. Kant puts these concepts into reality, but, even further, he breaks reality into what we can know and what we can think. These concepts are placed in the latter. This puts emphasis on the logic and reason of his philosophy, holding weight not just in what can be sensed, but more importantly, what can be conjured through rational thought. Taking the side of Hume, though, Kant asks importantly the development of concepts. He puts emphasis not on what we know, but also on how we know what we know. We get a further understanding beyond Hume's. It goes past the ideas of judgment, for Kant denies the practicality in doing such, as it would be counterproductive to the cause. Such things belong to a priori, and therefore have an origin that is at least near conceivable to the human mind. What Kant is concerned with locating, then, is the development of the sensible world through a transcendental philosophy. This seeks not to correct knowledge, but rather extend it and further support the foundations of beliefs. It is important to note the contradiction of the phrase, everything which happens has a cause, though, for this will show that development of concepts is based more heavily not on origin, but on a form of evolution. The phrase shows that the concept of cause signifies something different from that which happens, and so creates this contradiction. Kant is thus focused on a progress of thought in philosophy. Though we can see the impact that Kant has brought to philosophy, he bonded the empiricist thinking with the rationalist thinking, and vice versa. This is sometimes called the Copernican revolution. He puts more emphasis on the reality of things, and not on the extent to which our senses can progress knowledge. He also points out that the human mind has limits to its capabilities, like any container, and therefore not everything that exists can be known or recognized by mankind. This is important in that it shows the incompletion of epistemology and philosophy, yet it does not point them out necessarily as weaknesses or restraints, but rather as acceptable truths that can be overcome if balanced between both epistemological worlds of empiricism and rationalism. Though he lies more on Descartes' side, ruling out some of Hume's assumptions and judgments of the world, it is a blending between the two to certain degrees that truly accepts knowledge for what philosophy can understandably label it, and not how epistemology can divide it. Philosophy of High Noon. The movie High Noon has interesting comparisons to the philosophies and views of Kant. While many will say it can mirror the philosopher's views, particularly through the actions of the lead character Cain, this paper will analyze the interesting and somewhat contrary views by looking at the actions of Cain's wife. It is important to note first that Cain's wife is an emotional person. She is a religious woman, a Quaker to be precise, and chose this lifestyle after she saw her father and brother killed by guns. Her current viewpoints on guns, violence, and personal involvement reflect her emotional side, which Kant would clearly say is a weak point, and completely differs from Kantian view. Supporting her anti-Kantian ways is the fact that she focuses so much on the consequences. She does not see the act of killing simply for its act and the defensive purpose. She worries too much about who could and will die, and not enough about why they would risk their lives to perform the act. Kant would say that she does not see the duty in the individual's action, and rather is heavily focused on how and what it may lead into, no matter how unpredictable it is. On the contrary, it is also important to note that Cain's wife is an analytical person. She does rely on her reason to some degree to establish her own views on life. It is clear that she does not believe in killing because she finds it morally wrong in her religion, but she also analyzes the very human and mortal aspect of killing. She recognizes how worthless killing another man would be, and that it would shatter all your moral standards in doing so. One may say she is merely acting in the teachings of God, but she has come to accept this at her own willingness and establish these views after personal experience. Cain's wife is not just another religious fanatic protesting self-justice and mortal or civilized laws. She is a woman that has great self-respect and is able to transfer that respect amongst all life so that she can be clear of one thing. She can honestly and justifiably say that killing is wrong. She does have a strong moral basis. By the end of the movie, though, Cain's wife takes a drastic turn towards Kant's philosophy. She is able to set her mind free of worry and future analysis, and by doing so, realizes the duty that she has of protecting her husband, and of him protecting her. She is willing to break her view upon killing to save her husband, though she does not break her moral. What she does is justified and a logical moral act which Kant would promote for the simple fact that it follows the ethics of duty. It is clear that the character of Cain's wife is a dynamic one. She stays moral and true to herself through the whole movie. But how she defines this, or how her actions define her, is what changes. Though she does not lose her emotions to fulfill any actions, she is able to, in a way, push them aside and let them not interfere. Cain's wife always had the underlining rules for the ethics of duty, but it took a clear, determining act at the end to truly allow her to express what she already knew. Conclusion. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant is considered the most influential thinker of the Enlightenment era and one of the greatest Western philosophers of all time. His works, especially those on epistemology, the theory of knowledge, aesthetics, and ethics, had a profound influence on later philosophers, including contemporary ones. Besides establishing himself as one of the most foremost Western philosophers, Kant also made an important contribution to science and is considered one of the most important figures in the development of modern science, despite the fact that he was most interested in the philosophy of science and the knowledge that science produces. His main contribution to the rise of modern science was its liberation from theology. The future can and should be better than the present, and there is a way of making it so. It comes from embracing the modes of thought, feeling, and relating that recognize and make the most of life at all levels, and moving beyond the destructive, necrophilic mentalities and orders to ones biophilic and creative, resulting in similar transformations in all activities of humankind. It is time to embrace nature, humanity, and life itself, and to create for all these a viable future. The choice is about nothing less than artificial destruction of the planet and all its inhabitants, or a sustained improvement in the life of humans and nature for as long as the informed genius of humanity embraces and builds upon the givens that make it possible for nature and for humanity to flourish, grow, and reach ever greater achievement, and even richer experience and fruition of life.